Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining today. I'm John Bach from Spot by NetApp, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about how you can leverage Azure Spot VMs to help you to reduce costs and support your autoscaling applications in the cloud. So the starting point for conversations about things like Spot VMs is typically people trying to figure out how do they manage their budget and how do they keep their costs within that budget when they're looking at their cloud resources. It's very common that people quickly adopt cloud and expand in the cloud, only to find that the cost of doing so becomes extremely challenging for them to justify. Typically, we find that about 2/3 of that cost is actually related to the compute resources that people are using in the cloud, VMs and other types of instances that they're using to power those applications. But it's very commonly seen that most of that spend is actually significantly wasted or underutilized. It could be over-provisioned because you're worried about having too little capacity at a time when you might have a spike in your application demand. Or it could be simply idle capacity that you may be committed to buying, committed to utilizing, but then actually ended up not needing over time. So one of the first things people look at when they're trying to figure out, how do I reduce these costs, is they take a look at, the different pricing models that are available for compute in the cloud. Now, compute pricing models in the cloud have certainly grown more sophisticated over time. If you think about the variety of ways that you can buy compute capacity in the Azure cloud, there's a range of models that are available. There's pay-as-you-go, which basically means that you can go ahead and start up that virtual instance at any point. You can shut that down at any point. There's really no commitment, and you have a lot of flexibility there. There's also reserved VM instances, which basically are scenarios where you pay upfront to get a lower rate. And then there's Spot VMs, which is a relatively new pricing model that's been introduced in Microsoft Azure. Some of you may be familiar with low-priority VMs. This is effectively kind of a next generation of the low-priority VMs. Now, if we take a deeper look at some of the differences between those models, so one key dimension, of course, is price. The pay-as-you-go model usually comes with the highest price associated with the usage of that. It's typically a price hourly, or you can even break that down in many cases into even more granular increments. The flexibility, though, is very high. You don't have a commitment. You haven't committed to how long you're going to use that VM or for what. And you also have the full flexibility to change that at any time. You can turn it off. You can switch to a different type of VM instance, and so on. The availability is standard for that type of instance. So that type of instance is guaranteed to be allocated for you for as long as you need that. And certainly, there can be cases where that instance will fail, but it will then get automatically replaced by the underlying cloud infrastructure. Another model that people often look to as one of the first steps in reducing the cost of compute in the cloud is the reserved VM instances. So these reserved VM instances can offer a pretty significant discount off of those pay-as-you-go prices. 70% is the typical number that I see used. But they do come with some trade-offs. You do actually have to make an upfront commitment. You spend a certain amount of money upfront to kind of basically allocate that virtual instance for yourself. You can do that on either 1-year term or a 3-year term, but you also are committing to a specific type of VM and a specific region where that VM is going to be deployed. Once you have purchased that reserved VM, that is available to you, and for as long as you need to use that, that will be allocated to you. And the same as with the pay-as-you-go model, if that VM were to fail for some reason, the cloud infrastructure would actually automatically start up a new VM for that. And then there's Spot VMs. So Spot VMs, as I mentioned, is a relatively new model in the Azure compute resources options, but it offers even greater savings. What Spot VMs really are is they're a way for Microsoft to take all of the capacity that it has that is not currently being utilized and find ways to make that available to people at very low price. Now, this is a variable price. Depending on how much excess capacity there is, the price can vary. It's very similar to what you might find if you're looking at hotel rooms, for example, or airline tickets. The demand and the price actually do have that relationship. But you still don't have that need to have a commitment, and you still have a lot of flexibility. You can stop using that Spot instance at any time. You aren't required to make an upfront payment for that. But one of the other trade-offs you do have is that you actually don't have guarantees that that Spot VM is going to be allocated to you. If demand for compute resources in Azure goes up and Azure needs to reclaim some of those, you can get what's called an eviction notice. This eviction notice is effectively mean that your virtual machine is going to be shut down. And so you need to very quickly figure out how you're going to migrate that instance, how you're going to replace that, and so on. So given these differences, Spot VMs are pretty appealing for that pricing model in terms of being able to save a significant amount on your compute costs in the cloud and for the flexibility they provide. But the downside is there's no SLA for those Spot VMs. You don't know how long that Spot VM is going to be up and running. Termination can happen with a very brief warning. And the capacity of Spot VMs that are available can actually vary a lot depending on demand. So that can depend on the region that you want to allocate that VM in. It can depend on the size, the type of VM that you want, and even just the time of day. Fundamentally, it's very difficult for you to plan your capacity needs when you don't necessarily know what capacity is going to be available. And in times of high demand, there might not be any capacity available for Spot VMs. So fundamentally, if you do want to leverage Spot VMs, you're going to have to think about a number of different things. And one of the key things there is capacity planning. So how are you going to figure out how to make sure that your maximum capacity that you might need is actually going to be available at any given time? How are you going to figure out the provisioning workflow to make sure that you can provision as you want to scale up or even deprovision as you scale down? How do you have monitoring and learning in place so that if you do have an instance that were to fail, you know that, and you can go ahead and actually replace that instance? How do you actually monitor that supply to make sure that if you're about to try to scale up, you actually have the ability to get more Spot VMs? And then finally, how do you make kind of the decisions around pricing? Like, at what point is it actually a better choice to maybe use a reserved VM or maybe to use an on-demand VM because the spot pricing doesn't save you a significant amount at a given point in time because of demand? And so maybe sometimes that flexibility trade-off, is something that you actually want to shift a little bit differently. So these are all things that you typically are going to have to manage yourself. And that could be someone sitting there and manually doing a lot of this work, using some tools for monitoring, using some spreadsheets to figure out like what pricing models are most appropriate at a given time. Or it could be some hodgepodge of automated scripts plus a few third-party tools and so on. So that certainly is something that, your operations team may not actually have the capacity to really take on. They probably are not looking for new things to take on to have to monitor and use. And as a result, using Spot VMs is something that's in some ways, very difficult and not very common. But at the same time, there are some opportunities to find new and use technologies that allow you to think more holistically about ways to utilize Spot VMs. And that's really what we're providing here as Spot by NetApp. So one of our core products that we've actually recently updated for Microsoft Azure is a product that we call Elastigroup. So Elastigroup is fundamentally an auto-scaling infrastructure component that figures out how to optimize the costs by leveraging the appropriate and best available types of instances. It ensures that you still get the right SLAs even when you're optimizing using Spot instances. So for example, it will be able to predict and proactively replace instances. And then finally, it really simplifies your operations. A lot of things like scaling, some aspects of monitoring, helping to make sure you have the right capacity. That's something that's actually taken care of by Elastigroup itself. So in many ways, you can think of this as basically just, automated, don't worry about it, infrastructure for scalable applications. And one thing that's actually valuable is that there are an increasing number of applications that actually are built to take advantage of these capabilities for scaling and to be able to handle different capacity configurations over time. So let's dive into a little bit more of the details there. So how does Elastigroup do this? Well, the first thing to know about Elastigroup is that Elastigroup actually is built based on this extensive database that we here at Spot have collected and analyzed over time. So we've analyzed cloud resources across all different regions, all different types of instances, and so on for many years. And so that's allowed us to actually go ahead and create these predictive algorithms. These predictive algorithms basically help us to figure out what are some of the things that predict the various behaviors, the pricing models, the behaviors of evictions, the timing of evictions. Then we complement that with some real-time monitoring and analytics. And that real-time monitoring analytics basically then allows us to figure out what are the capacity trends, what are the pricing changes that are happening in these Spot VM markets. So with that information, then there's a number of great things we can do. One example is that we can do predictive replacement for instances. So we talked earlier about how Spot VMs can be reclaimed by the Azure cloud whenever there's a need because of increasing demand for compute resources in a given region. One of the things that we can do in Elastigroup is because we have those predictive algorithms and we have that extensive database and we have that real-time monitoring, we can actually prevent the interruption and the disruption that would be caused by that eviction. If you think about a traditional application, if you're running that, if I were to have an eviction event, I probably in most cases wouldn't be able to really quickly react to that and within 30 seconds get everything moved onto a new instance and be able to continue. And so what would happen is, I'd lose that instance, that Spot VM, then quickly try to re-provision a new Spot VM and get capacity back up to what I actually needed. Now, there could be cases where I actually lose a Spot VM because there's too much demand, and so there's not enough capacity available for Spot VMs in that given Microsoft Azure location or of a given type in that location. And so then as a result, if I were basing my infrastructure capacity on Spot VMs, I would actually be short of the capacity I needed. I simply would not be able to get enough Spot VMs to fulfill the required capacity that I needed. That would probably cause some type of performance interruption. It could cause a service interruption for the users of that application. Fundamentally things that I really want to avoid. Now, if you think about on the right, that's really what Elastigroup does. So on the right, you can see, Elastigroup, it has that predictive model. It identifies instances and VMs that are likely to be given eviction at a given time. And then it proactively adds additional capacity, and then once that new capacity is online and it's migrated, the relevant state, connections, network, and so on and so forth, then it can actually take that instance that was likely to be evicted and actually shut that down. And so what that's allowing you to do is fundamentally never have that dip in capacity. You're always ahead of the game in terms of figuring out what that prediction model says you need to do to avoid that interruption. Another key capability that you can leverage with Elastigroup is the fact that if there isn't Spot VM capacity in a given region, it will automatically leverage on-demand and pay-as-you-go instances. So those pay-as-you-go instances will automatically be brought in to make sure that you still have that capacity that you need. So fundamentally what Elastigroup is doing here is it's really basically giving you the ability to ensure that you can maintain your SLAs by predicting and proactively acting to prevent these interruptions that could be caused by Spot VMs being evicted. Now, that's not all that Elastigroup does. Elastigroup is also constantly monitoring the pricing models and the prices of Spot VMs. So, for example, if there's not availability of Spot VMs, it knows that it can fall back to pay-as-you-go. If there might be scenarios where the pricing of Spot VMs has risen to the point where there's really not much difference between a pay-as-you-go VM and a Spot VM, it can automatically start using pay-as-you-go VMs to give you some additional capabilities there. But whenever there's capacity again, Elastigroup will automatically revert you back to be able to start using those Spot VMs again. And throughout this all, it's actually always ensuring that the storage, the network configuration, and the state are all kept consistent and persistent and restored across, any places where I needed to replace a VM with a new VM. So that fundamentally is one of the key properties. Like, it allows you to get that cost savings from Spot VMs, which can be up to 90%, and to be able to get that across all the different scenarios that you might have in terms of your application, whether it needs to scale up and it wants to do that in the most cost efficient way, or in cases where you need to figure out what capacity is available and how do I most efficiently utilize capacity in a given Azure region. Now, another key part of what Elastigroup does is not just related to the pricing model, it's also related to the scaling aspect. So one of the challenges of scaling, of course, is if you don't have something that can handle this automatically based on application needs, what you end up doing is you end up over-provisioning. So to be safe, you want to make sure you never run out of having enough capacity and resources to meet your application demands. And so what you end up having is, you can see here in the orange on the left, that basically over-allocated amount of capacity that you're still paying for. And in many cases, you're typically doing that with on-demand resources, some of the most expensive VMs that are available in the Azure cloud. But what Spot can do is Spot actually will monitor your application needs based on some configurable parameters that you can set. And Elastigroup will automatically scale up and down in the most efficient way possible. So what it's really doing is it's really kind of fine-tuning your scaling so that you don't have that over-allocation. And one of the great things about Elastigroup is it's really well-tuned to be really efficient about provisioning new VMs and also about identifying when you don't need that extra capacity, and you can actually shut that down to save you that extra money. So fundamentally, if I were to sum this up, what Elastigroup and Spot are really all about is we're really all about figuring out how to give your applications what they need. We're monitoring them constantly to make sure that we can identify what resources you need, when we need to scale up, when we need to scale down. But then figuring out automatically for you, how do you most efficiently use the compute options available in the cloud, whether that's pay-as-you-go, whether that's reserved, or whether that's Spot VMs. And so that's something that's happening just continuously in an automated way. It's not something that you have to manually monitor. It's not something you have to build your own tools for. It's really taking, what would consume a significant amount of, your operations team's time and just making that something that's automatically available to you that you can use constantly. Really, this is part of the overall life cycle that we're seeing more and more people think about when they get into the cloud. Everyone's very familiar with continuous integration, continuous deployment as being key parts of your application and software deployment lifecycle. But the thing that people actually haven't really put as much into previously has been thinking about this aspect of what do you do once you've deployed. So people will deploy that configuration that they estimated was the optimal configuration to start with. But then how do you continuously monitor, scale, tune, optimize that to make sure you're cost efficient, to make sure you're meeting your availability needs, to make sure you're meeting your capacity demands? That's really where we fit in at Spot, is we help complete that whole pipeline by providing these tools like Elastigroup that are focused on how you can do continuous optimization of resources in the cloud. Now, just to give you a simple example of a customer doing this, Carbon is a customer that's been working with us in Azure, and they fundamentally have been using Elastigroup to help them to leverage this excess capacity and the price and the cost and benefits of doing that in the cloud. For them, the key benefit, they could do this as basically kind of an out-of-the-box solution. They didn't need to write their own scripts. They didn't need to integrate a bunch of different tools. Spot basically works, in their Azure account. It leverages, their Azure security perimeter. It's not something where they have to worry about setting up, some SaaS product that's outside of their security perimeter. Elastigroup is actually sitting inside their account, monitoring those resources they're using. And there are many other customers who are using Spot products as well. So whether it's small startups to global enterprises, Spot has over 1,000 customers. So this is proven technology. It's been in the market for many years. And we've been consistently and constantly tuning that and improving it. As you can see here at Ignite, we actually have continued to advance that as well. Microsoft announced earlier this year the general availability of Spot VMs, and we've quickly worked to make sure that Elastigroup can take advantage of them. So that's a very brief introduction summary of Elastigroup and the capabilities it can provide. If you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to go over to spot.io. we can work with you to provide the ability to try out Elastigroup. We certainly have videos, papers, webinars, documentation, like all the different things you need to learn more about Elastigroup. And then we can help you to get set up to actually try that out in your own Azure account. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you, and look forward to talking to you again soon.